Carthago delenda es. Loosely translated, this is Latin for Carthage must be destroyed. According to legend, Marcus Cato, also remembered as Cato the Elder, ended all of his speeches to the Roman Senate with this phrase or something like it. Whether or not the speech had anything to do with Carthage did not matter. Cato simply felt the notion important enough that he ended every oration with this demand, reminding his fellow senators that he still considered Carthage to be a threat to Roman survival. Hello and welcome to the Western Traditions Podcast. This is the 11th episode in my podcast series about the Roman Empire. Today we will step back for a moment from the trajectory of Roman expansion and take a look at Carthage, the great counterpart and enemy of the Roman Republic. The century-long war with this Mediterranean merchant empire would not only transform Rome into a global superpower, but also come to define Roman culture. The Romans, in a way, were Romans in the way that they were not Carthaginians. In the same way, for example, during the 20th century, the way that the United States was defined was sort of based on how different it was from the Soviet Union in terms of government, culture, morals, religion, and so on, and vice versa. The Soviets were in some way publicly defined in the way that they were unlike Americans. The Romans and the Carthaginians, in hindsight anyway, were similarly characterized as opposed counterparts in the war, not only for political, military, and commercial power in the ancient Western Mediterranean, but also in winning the hearts and minds of their neighbors. The same dichotomy between opponents in war happens all the time. The battle between Greece and Persia was turned into, accurately or inaccurately, a war between freedom and slavery. The Peloponnesian War is often seen as a war between democracy and oligarchy. Now, just as we look at Carthage, we will also go on in future episodes to look at a number of other cultures and societies in the Mediterranean region, cultures and societies that would soon be swept up into the Roman milieu and lose much of their ethnic and cultural identities. But I will probably not set aside entire episodes to do so, like I did today. Carthage gets its own episode because prior to Roman expansion, the Carthaginians were the dominant force in the region. The cultural impact of Rome's conquest of Italy, Sicily, Africa, Sardinia, Spain, France, and other areas cannot be overstated, because these were not simply military subjugations that the Romans accomplished. Rome turned the subjects of its conquests into new Roman citizens, sometimes right away, sometimes after a period of occupation. Regardless, a few centuries after the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean and the areas surrounding, people born in France, born in Croatia, born in Tunisia, born in Britain, born in Palestine, people born in Spain would call themselves Romans. They would do this without hesitation, even if they preserved certain vestiges of their ancient patrimony and their local culture. In fact, for many years, even after the city of Rome and the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, people in pockets of Europe and Africa, areas completely out of contact with the Eastern Empire based out of Constantinople, these people would continue to call themselves Romans. It would be a long time before people began to see themselves as inhabitants of new nations born in the wake of Rome's decline. So it will be up to you as you make progress through Roman history to determine for yourself if it was Rome that actively sought to erase the cultural identities of its subjects, or if it was simply that these subjects, these new Roman citizens, over time embraced Roman values and culture to the exclusion of their own. So, given that Rome, one way or the other, obliterated many ancient cultures of Europe and North Africa, it is fitting that we stop and discover what we can about the ways of life that characterize the people of these lands. And as always, I encourage you to stop and to discover the website for this podcast at western-traditions.org. That's western-traditions.org. Head on over there if you're not already on the website, and there you will find all the podcasts and their various series, as well as pictures and maps and links to good books. If you wish to support the podcast, please consider buying some merchandise or contributing directly through the PayPal or Patreon options. Patreon members get insider access to behind-the-scenes developments in the podcast and extra links to interesting and pertinent historical topics. In my first series of podcasts about the ancient world, I devoted episode 16 to studying ancient Phoenicia and Canaan. In that episode, I mentioned how the ancient Phoenicians would reappear at points throughout history. Their cities of Tyre and Sidon were then mentioned in the Old Testament. And later, Alexander the Great encounters them during his conquests. Alexander was the first ruler to ever truly subjugate these people, as the Phoenicians' well-defended coastal cities and powerful navies forced even the great rulers of Mesopotamia and the pharaohs of Egypt to settle for merely accepting these people as subjects in a sort of cooperative league without ever really mastering them the way that they did the remainder of the people in their empires. But even after Alexander the Great forced the Phoenicians into servitude, a remnant of their culture remained free in Carthage. And actually, to call it a remnant is to do an injustice to it. Carthage may have been far away from the ancient and wealthy civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, but that city ruled over and probably influenced a much larger region of the world and surpassed, in many ways, the city that originally founded the colony. But how did the Phoenicians come to Carthage anyway? I described in that 16th episode of the first series how the Phoenicians were the first to roam the Mediterranean, and probably also the Atlantic at will by sea. Phoenician merchants first set out in their sturdy longships from the Levantine coast thousands of years ago. Over the centuries, they made contact with peoples as far away as Spain and with peoples along the Atlantic coasts of Europe and Africa. And among these distant peoples, they sometimes established outposts for trade and commerce. In fact, Cadiz, a modern Spanish city on the Atlantic coastline, was founded by the Phoenicians from the city of Tyre over 3,000 years ago. Like the great cities of the Phoenicians back east, Cadiz was built on an extremely defensible seaside location on a peninsula whose only connection to the mainland Europe was a narrow isthmus. Now, the Phoenicians who colonized Carthage did not have the exact same opportunities for finding such a defensible location, but they did manage to place the city on a peninsula, though the isthmus connecting it to mainland Africa was quite a bit wider than they would have liked, and they were forced to build great walls to defend their city, rather than simply rely on the sea to deter their enemies, as people did at Tyre and at Cadiz and at Sidon. And they named their freshly settled North African colony Carthage, which means new city in Phoenician. The Romans would someday pronounce this as Carthago. A map of the city on its peninsula can be found on the website at western-traditions.org. Now, I mentioned that the city was in Africa. This word Africa is important. Where the actual word comes from is uncertain. A Greek word, Afrikae, meaning free from cold, may be the origin. But during the Roman era, the word Africa did not apply to the continent of Africa as we use it today. That's one reason why I pause to consider the word now. When the ancients, particularly the Romans, spoke of Africa, they were referring mostly to what we would today call the country of Tunisia, or the northern parts of it anyway. In other words, the more fertile lands of the northern African coastline. This region of the continent would continue to be known simply as Africa for centuries. In AD 293, the Roman Empire will be divided among 4 emperors in a political arrangement known as the Tetrarchy, which was instituted by the Emperor Diocletian, probably as one of many solutions applied to the crises of the 3rd century, but more on that in a later episode. Anyway, the empire at that time was divided into 4 portions, one for each imperial executive to manage. And one of those portions was made up of Italy and Africa, meaning this northern coastal area of the continent that we now call Africa. It was considered to be a vital Roman possession due to its crucial location near the Straits of Sicily. It was essentially a choke point in the Mediterranean, and it was also valued for the fertility of its soil. But what exactly did this region, known as Africa, consist of? To the east of it in those days, along the Mediterranean coast of Africa, were Cyrene and Libya, before you reached Egypt. These lands were notoriously barren, though not completely devoid of life or civilization. To the west of ancient Carthage, there was the coast of modern-day Algeria and Morocco, also not known for their welcoming geography, at least not if you wanted to farm the land or graze your livestock and support a large population. Carthage, though, and much of what we essentially call today northern Tunisia, was a different matter. The land here, while not as fertile, say, as many other European coasts of the Mediterranean, was much more welcoming. Here you could grow a variety of crops, including olive trees and wine grapes. There was, at the time anyway, also much more lumber available in the Mediterranean woodlands of this region, and this would be naturally important for a maritime power like Carthage. And a maritime power Carthage was. Perhaps due to their central location, the Phoenicians who inhabited the city were able to establish their own network of outposts and trading partners throughout the western Mediterranean. The eastern Mediterranean had been densely populated for thousands of years, and the markets were long established. The western Mediterranean, though, 3,000 years ago, was still the frontier in a way, with little in the way of any kind of international law or rules regarding trade and politics. It was probably the Carthaginians, not the Romans, who first brought civilization to places like Africa, Spain, France, and Sicily. But how much land did they actually rule over? Like many city-states of the time, Carthage's rulers held most of their direct power just over the city itself and the land immediately contiguous to it. But we have to see political power in the way that the ancients saw it. When we spoke of the extent of the power of the Persian king, for example, his was not some sort of legislative or executive power the way that we see it. Most of us today live in very centralized states with some sort of federal power structure, and we are bound to obey laws which are passed hundreds or even thousands of miles away by a government whose agents are everywhere and are ready to enforce those laws and inflict punishment on those who do not obey. During most of our history, though, power was something more like influence. The Persian king relied on the loyalty of his satraps, his political lieutenants, to run things appropriately in their far-flung specific regions. He counted on them to manage things and to provide him with things like taxes, troops, and so on. But they could conspire and rebel, and sometimes did. And really, people might do as they please in more far-flung regions of the empire without much worry of intervention from their capital, provided that they sent whatever was required of them at the right time to their king. Furthermore, there would be regions outside this more or less direct extension of the central power, other city-states which paid tribute to it or furnished troops for it or were otherwise obligated to serve that central power somehow, even if they were not actual subjects of that central power. If we look at power this way, as both direct control and strong influence over another state, we see that Carthage then, in a sense, ruled over a very large realm by the time that the confrontation with Rome came about in the 3rd century BC. Now, much of northern modern-day Tunisia was directly part of the city's domain, and lieutenants of the city government directly managed those areas. Beyond that, though, there was a whole world of dependent cities with varying degrees of freedom, but all tied in one way or another to the city of Carthage and bound to obey her. Much of that otherwise barren coast of northern Africa belonged to Carthage in that sense. East, all the way to the limits of Egypt, the peoples of those lands obeyed Carthage and provided her not only with trade partners, but also with the mercenaries that the city needed to survive. And in a coming segment, I will go on to describe why Carthage did not rely on its own people to supply its army with soldiers. And west, all the way to the Atlantic coast of the African continent, Carthage also ruled and drew upon the populace to supply soldiers. And furthermore, much of coastal Spain, the Balearic Islands, Corsica, Sardinia, and parts of Sicily, these also were under Carthage's quote-unquote protection at this time. Now, when I hear of such protectorates, such states under the protection of more powerful nations, I think of a darkly humorous meme that I saw on social media some time ago. The text of the video in the meme states that the people of a third world country suddenly say to themselves, "We're going to be rich. We discovered oil. And then to the tune of some very heavy music, you see a bald eagle clearly representing the United States turn and stare at the viewer, and these words appear on the screen: "Yes, we did." So the protectorates of Carthage may or may not have been very grateful for the protection that she provided. Protection usually came at the cost not only of the sovereignty of these subject cities, but it also required either direct payments, exclusive control of resources handed over to Carthage, extremely favorable tariffs and privileges for Carthaginian citizens in the protected city, and so on. You know, when this sort of arrangement happens at the street level, we call it a protection racket, and it's illegal. Local criminals make your business or your home pay a fee, and you maybe give certain privileges to them in order for you to be quote-unquote protected from crime. I lived in San Pedro Sula in Honduras for a year, and I paid a security company to protect my home and my family from crime. Most of the other homeowners did as well, and those that didn't would inevitably get robbed, and they were probably being robbed by the people in the security company. So governments crack down on these protection rackets because they don't want the competition. Now, we know a bit about the extent of Carthaginian influence and power in the Western Mediterranean, but what were they like, these Carthaginians? How was society among themselves organized? Who were their gods? Why were they able to rise above their neighbors and enforce their will on the Western Mediterranean until the Romans came along? It will probably always be difficult to understand anything about Carthaginian culture. Remember that nearly all the descriptions of their civilization which remain today were written by their enemies. Romans, such as Cato the Elder and others, heaped scorn on Carthaginian morals and their general character as a people. For a long time then, historians have been wary about accepting the morbid stories of infant sacrifice, of sexual immorality, of gluttony, and the greed which the Romans depicted as central to Carthaginian life. Even the viewpoints of most of the Greeks who write about Carthage must be regarded with some distrust. Plutarch, after all, lived a few centuries after Carthage was wholly destroyed, and while he was Greek, he lived in a completely Romanized world by then. So, as with most of his essays, we must take his accounts with a grain of salt. And as for the Greek historian Polybius, yes, he did in fact live during the era of the Punic Wars, but he was a Roman hostage, and he was also known to be eager to please his Roman hosts. So when even these non-Romans depicted the Carthaginians as possessing some profoundly disagreeable traits, we must question their motives in telling us so. If we look to much earlier writers, however, we get a much less vehement take on Carthaginian society. For instance, Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century BC, long before the Punic Wars, he writes that the constitution of Carthage was, quote, in many respects superior to all others, unquote. Given that Aristotle had studied and written so much about various Greek styles of government, this is high praise. In describing the Carthaginian state, Aristotle also reflects his approval when he reminds us that, quote, a state is proved to be well ordered when the commons are steadily loyal to the constitution, when no civil conflict worth speaking of has arisen, and when no one has succeeded in making himself a dictator. So the government had been stable there in Carthage for some time, apparently. In fact, Carthaginian government sounds quite a bit like Roman government. There was a lower and an upper house of legislature, with the upper house being made up primarily of representatives from the upper classes, and the government was led by two elected leaders, much like the consuls in Rome, except that these two executives were known as shofetes, which is a Phoenician word that we typically translate into English as judges. Since we have already learned that other Italian societies also had similar governmental arrangements, and now, as the Romans, and now we hear of a completely different culture on the African side of the Mediterranean with a similar political organization, we must begin to believe then that the Roman system of democracy, however anomalous it may appear to us now when studied on its own, it was not really unique. So therefore, Rome did not overcome the surrounding cultures in the Mediterranean simply because it was somewhat democratic and the other cultures were despotic failed states, as some might allow themselves to think. Everyone else in the Mediterranean, it appears, was also involved in some sort of democracy. Although, as I have stated constantly in this series and in the Greek series of podcasts, democracy back then was not universal suffrage for any of the ancients. In almost all cases, suffrage was restricted to men who owned land. And by that, I do not just mean that they owned a personal home like some of us, but rather quite a bit of land to use for farming and pasturing animals and growing olive trees and wine grapes and so on. Most of us listening to this podcast, in fact, no matter how well that we think we've done in life, most of us would have probably been slaves in antiquity, even those of us who are professionals, or we would have lived just above the level of slaves as freedmen plying a trade. Most of these so-called democracies that I describe in the podcast were something more like expanded oligarchies or aristocracies. And permit me now another brief digression about that word I used earlier, shofet, or judge. This was the title used for each of the two men who held executive power in Carthage. Instead of consuls, they were the shofetes, or the judges. Now, this is the same word, literally the same word, shofet, used in the Bible to describe the early leaders of Israel. Hence, we have the book of Judges, the book of Shofetes. You see, the Jews, the Phoenicians, and the Carthaginians were all Semites with a similar language background and presumably with similar cultures. Now, I'll get more into the possible implications of this later in the podcast, but it is interesting to wonder about how much the culture of Carthage may have resembled that of ancient Israel. For example, the Old Testament speaks more than once of people in the local area sacrificing their children to Moloch, who was indeed a Canaanite god and who had a counterpart in the divine pantheon of Carthage. And we've come back to that one particular aspect of Carthaginian culture which has darkened opinion on them for thousands of years now, child sacrifice. Now, it is fair to be suspicious of Roman characterization of Carthaginians, though, given the strong feelings that they had about the importance of family and children. But it should be noted that most Greek writers do also describe this most hideous detail remembered about Carthaginian culture, the infamous rituals of child sacrifice. Since the Greeks themselves were notably indifferent to the practice of infanticide, it is less likely that they would be motivated to try to slander the Carthaginians with such descriptions, and so we can put a little more stock into the believability of their stories. Nevertheless, regardless of whether these characterizations of Carthaginian culture were true or not, it's still valuable to hear the Roman view of Carthage because these characterizations of others tells us something about the people providing those descriptions. It tells us about the Romans themselves. Recall that psychological phenomenon of projection. Now, I'm not really suggesting the idea that the Romans were projecting their own views or desires on someone else, but rather that when they focused on the perceived flaws of their enemies, they focused on those areas of life which were most important to they themselves as Romans. So that the way that the Carthaginians handled things like economics, sex, family, and so on received a lot of attention from the Romans, perhaps because these things were deemed so vital in Roman society, and the Carthaginians observed those aspects of life distinctly. Note that the Romans say very little about Carthaginian politics, perhaps because their governments were so similar. The following history of Carthage will be drawn from all sources, even those whose motives are suspect. The Phoenicians had spread around the western Mediterranean by 1000 BC. According to their own legend, Carthage was founded in 814 BC by Dido, the daughter of the king of Tyre, or perhaps it's Dido, but I pronounce it Dido. And Tyre was the great Phoenician city on the coast of Canaan in the eastern Mediterranean. We've also heard of Dido in the Aeneid, the great epic about the founding of Rome. In that story, the Roman hero slept with Dido, but eventually abandoned her, causing her to take her own life. The significance and symbolism of the Roman hero using the Carthaginian queen sexually and then tossing her aside cannot be overlooked. However, the city was actually founded, it was not immediately the leading city of the Phoenicians in the West. The Phoenicians were more commercially minded than other cultures, and initially they were not terribly interested in conquest or military organization. They founded and settled scattered cities that traded with the local natives around the Mediterranean and maintained a network of trade and wealth among themselves. Less than a century after Carthage itself was founded, though, the Greeks began appearing in the western Mediterranean, looking to establish their own colonies. Now, the Greeks were less shy about military confrontation and soon came into conflict, both military and commercial, with the Phoenician colonies in the west. Now, the Greeks were not yet a credible threat in the eastern Mediterranean, where great powers like Egypt, Syria, and Persia deterred any inroads against their long-established trading power. So anyway, faced with these aggressive Greek newcomers, the Phoenicians of the western Mediterranean rallied around Carthage, and after a century or two of conflict, Carthage had organized the other Phoenician city-states of the western Mediterranean into virtually an empire of her own. It was made up mostly of subordinate cities who paid tributes and dues and taxes of various kinds to her. The Greeks had by then, for the most part, been kicked out of the western Mediterranean, and the Carthaginians had essentially established a new order there, along with the Etruscans and with some Greeks who remained stubbornly in places like Sicily and the city of Massilia, which is modern-day Marseille in France. And then, slowly, the Carthaginians began to extend their power inland into modern-day Tunisia. This is an important moment of transition. Until now, all Phoenician cities had really been coastal settlements placed on peninsulas and islands and easily defended with a minimum of troops. They relied rather on naval power to protect them from their enemies, and even that naval power was not primarily martial. Their ships were manned by merchants and sailors who were capable of military violence, yes, but most of their activity was devoted to trade. Now, though, little by little, as they expanded into mainland Africa, the Carthaginians became landowners. In the couple centuries prior to their famous conflict with Rome, the upper classes of the Carthaginians, the collective rulers not only of the city but of the entire network of Phoenicians and their dependents around the western Mediterranean, these powerful families, once merchant sea princes, now became a landed aristocracy. The historian Diodorus describes the inland homes of the elite with vast landscapes over which their livestock roamed, intersected by olive trees and grapevines and channels of water irrigating this paradise in northern Africa. But this should not distract us from the primarily seaward and commercial focus of Carthaginian wealth. Even though the Carthaginians became more involved in agriculture, we should not forget that they were still primarily a maritime people, with their faces turned toward the sea and their minds engrossed in profits. Indeed, this commercially minded character explains a lot about the Carthaginians' later struggles in facing the Romans and even in just maintaining their empire. The military forces of the Carthaginians, you see, were made up primarily of mercenaries. Yes, we will hear of the famous Carthaginian generals and admirals during the course of the Punic Wars. Carthage was careful to keep supreme military leadership mostly in the hands of her own people, but the lion's share of the fighting was done by foreigners. These are at least a couple of reasons. There's at least a couple of reasons for this that have nothing to do with the valor or cowardice of the average Carthaginian. The free population of Carthage and of other Phoenician cities in the empire, this population, it was always small. It had been small from the beginning. When the Carthaginians arrived centuries before to found their colony, and the other Phoenicians as well, only a handful of merchant families and their servants and so on would come, bringing with them mercenary troops for defense. So there were comparably far fewer actual Carthaginians than there were Romans. These weren't like Greek or Roman colonies where they would send out masses of their own people to found a city. These were trading outposts. Remember that the Romans had been rapidly expanding their citizen population, both by accepting more and more middle classes into the voting ranks and also by turning the people of conquered lands into citizens. But this same thing had not happened with the Carthaginians. Nevertheless, we should not completely underestimate the number of free Carthaginians. I mean, by 300 BC, the city of Carthage is estimated to have held at least 500,000 people, making it one of the biggest cities, if not the biggest, in the world. Even if their free population was limited in size, there were still plenty of Carthaginians. But more significant, perhaps, was that most of those free citizens of Carthage and other Phoenician colonies were simply not a bunch of farmers. They were sailors and merchants and tradesmen and fishermen. They maintained the precious trade networks that kept the cities of their commercial league fed and supplied, and thus they were basically too valuable to lose in battle. Which is not to say that no Carthaginians fought in battles, only that they never made up the majority of Carthage's armed forces, not until the very end. The men and women working in the fields beyond the city were usually foreigners, and if they had any autonomy at all, they were still sharecroppers, basically, and thus just barely surviving on the fringes of society and not participating in the government. Furthermore, when speaking of their ultimately disastrous confrontation with Rome, regardless of who made up their army and navy, the Carthaginians were fundamentally not militaristic. And I'm not saying this out of some sort of revisionist history bent. I'm not trying to upend the traditional Rome good, Carthage bad narrative, however flawed it may be. I'm not trying to say that the Carthaginians were peace-loving pacifists. It's just that the Carthaginians understood what all oligarchies must understand if they want to survive, that militarism is ultimately bad for business, and it's bad for the status of the oligarchs. History has proven endlessly and without exception that war leads ultimately to two results for oligarchies. If an oligarchy relies on mercenaries in its military, like Carthage did, and it engages too often in war, this will eventually lead to a coup and to a mercenary-supported tyranny. This had in fact already been attempted in Carthage, and it had been put down some years prior to the Punic War. Now, if an oligarchy uses its own citizens too often in combat or otherwise abuses their services, the people will eventually revolt and impose a democracy. Consider the history of Greece. The Spartan constitution addressed just this issue. They were discouraged from venturing out to war too often because the drafters of the constitution, the oligarchs, possibly including Lycurgus, but probably others as well, they understood that going to war too often would bring about disastrous changes in their culture. And this was proven by history. Listen to my 5-part sequence of episodes on the Peloponnesian War to see how Sparta and Spartans were ultimately changed by engaging too long in war. Perhaps the Carthaginians understood what a wise man once told me. Violence is not just a tool that you can pick up and put down. When you use it, it uses you back. So Carthage thought of the military primarily for defensive purposes. Whenever the city did find itself in conflict, it always looked to resolve the issue as quickly as possible, either through negotiations or quick military victories. They were not afraid of short bursts of violence. They were not afraid to strike a hard blow in battle, but this sort of thing would also typically be followed quickly by an offer of a truce and a treaty, showing that their desire to achieve their goals through means other than combat were viable, even if those other means still involved coercion of some sort. It will be important to consider these apparently diametrically opposed natures of Carthaginian society when compared to the Romans. The Roman upper classes were almost entirely a landed aristocracy and had been for some time. There was no history of a class of ruling sea merchants there as there was in Carthage, and by the start of the confrontation with Carthage in 264 BC, the Romans were long accustomed to solving their political issues with violence. It would not be until after the Punic Wars that they realized how much the long war had altered their society and their government. Furthermore, as a society, before the Punic Wars, Rome almost completely ignored the sea. This seems hard to believe, given that they were not some landlocked culture, but rather had decent access to the sea. But perhaps that old saying attributed to Cicero, in which he said that the best estates were used to raise cattle, perhaps that can enlighten us here. The Romans were just not interested in the sea. They were interested in land and the way it could be used, and not the opportunities that the ocean presented. Of course, perhaps this Roman disinterest was also a product of the already existing monopolies that the Greeks and Carthage and other Phoenicians had over the sea lanes when Rome was still rising up. But regardless, Rome was a land power with a large citizen population of rural peasant farmers, and Carthage was an urban society ruled by a small merchant elite who derived their wealth from trading over the ocean waves. Nevertheless, watch closely as we progress through the Punic Wars in the coming episodes. Just as Roman culture will be changed by the long conflict and by their eventual victory, Carthaginian culture will be changed by the lengthy engagement and by their defeats. And when Carthage finally does take somewhat seriously the importance of a land army, they will put forth a man, Hannibal, the son of Hamilcar Barca, who will be remembered, even by his enemies the Romans, as one of the greatest generals of all time, rivaling even the skills and the perseverance of men like Pyrrhus of Epirus and Alexander the Great, even if, in the end, he was defeated. But about the baby killing, there's just no getting away from that one. Everyone wants an explanation, so we should look into it. But let's start with an overall look at the Carthaginian people, their religion, and their culture. Now, genetically, they were a Semitic people, transplants from Canaan and from the region known today as Lebanon. As far as we know, not just relying on Roman accounts, but also on archaeology, on ruins, and other sources, Carthaginian men wore beards, they went about in these long flowing robes, and they wore sandals. While the climate of the northern coast of Tunisia is a little more moderate than most of the rest of North Africa, it is still warm, and loose-fitting clothing would have been required. In Egypt, where it was even warmer, people handled the heat by frequently going about naked. As with their Roman counterparts, there were originally, anyway, not a lot of names to go around in Carthaginian society. As you go through the Punic Wars with me, it's not simply that you will hear many names repeated over and over again. I mean, after all, in English, how many men are named John or Peter or Mark or David? But you really won't hear many different names at all. There are men named Hannibal, there are men named Hamilcar, there are men named Hanno, there are men named Mago, and there are men named Hasdrubal, and there's a few others. But that same handful of names just seems to be passed around among the upper classes of Carthaginian society. So do not be alarmed the first time you hear the name Hannibal in the coming episodes about the First Punic War. It will actually still be quite a while until we get to the Second Punic War and the most famous of all Hannibals appears. Now, these men may have been parsimonious with their names, but they reputedly wore colorful clothes, and they adorned themselves with jewelry or other accessories. Such public show, however, was only for men. Carthaginian women were mostly kept in seclusion, except for a small number who became priestesses. Otherwise, women wore veils and lived mostly in the home. Now, we know these things from more neutral sources and from surviving ruins and artwork. Unfortunately, about their actual personal lives, we can, for the most part, only rely on the Romans, and they have little good to say about the Carthaginians. Quote, Heavy eaters and drinkers, loving to gather in dinner clubs, and as loose in their sex relations as they were corrupt in their politics, unquote. Thus, Will Durant eloquently sums up the Roman view of the Carthaginians. But this seems too easy an aspersion to cast on an enemy. I suspect that just as there were among the Romans, there were probably some very decadent Carthaginians, and there were probably some pretty straight-laced ones too. It seems a shame to me that the Romans could not do as the Greeks did when writing of their ancestral enemies, the Trojans. Many passages in the Iliad and in later Greek plays do quite a bit of justice to the honor of Trojan characters, even though they were the hated enemy. The Romans seem to find it difficult to say anything good about the Carthaginians. Now, like virtually all men of the time period, the Carthaginians worshipped a variety of gods. Among them was Tanith, their local version of Astarte, the Phoenician goddess of fertility, love, and the feminine realm. And there was also Melkart, whose name meant key of the city, and there were many minor gods as well. Perhaps the most important of them all was Baal Haman. Yes, his name was Baal, that's B-A-A-L, just like the hated Canaanite god often mentioned in the Old Testament. Baal simply meant Lord in Canaanite languages. He was probably the local version of the Canaanite god Moloch. According to what we are told, the Carthaginians were accustomed to sacrifice children, specifically infants, to Baal Haman during certain times of crisis, sometimes going so far as to offer hundreds of babies for sacrifice at a single ceremony. In one depiction of this hideous sacrament, each wailing child was laid on the outstretched arms of the massive idol, and these arms were inclined toward the god's open belly, where a fire continuously burned, and so the child would roll down the arms into the fire to be followed by another and then another. Over time, aristocrats would seek to preserve their children from these sacrifices, and they would purchase the children of poor people as substitutes. Now, as much as we may be disinclined to believe such an outrageous tale, we should remember that it is not just Romans, but others who, at the very least, confirm this custom of child sacrifice among the Carthaginians. And though the consensus was once divided, more and more archaeological evidence has come forward to confirm that the Canaanite ancestors of the Carthaginians also did indeed sacrifice children. This was once thought to be simply a calumny of Canaanite culture described by the authors of the Old Testament who had a dog in the fight. But evidence shows that it was a reality, one way or the other. Now, I'm not going to pretend some sort of moral neutrality when I consider this religious practice. It appalls me. But we should consider that people around the ancient world practiced a wide variety of methods to deal with unwanted children and populations that sometimes surged beyond the society's current capacity to feed them. We have already heard about the Spartans disposing of inferior children or deformed babies by throwing them off a cliff. And it should perhaps not surprise us that some people making the same choice might try to attach a religious significance to infanticide, to make it part of a religious ritual and not a personal choice. And also remember, among the Canaanites and even among the Jews of the Old Testament, sacrifices were burnt upon the altar. So if children were to be sacrificed, burning them does obey a sort of internal logic to the whole scheme. Recall Abraham in Genesis chapter 22. While he raises the knife to dispatch his only son Isaac, he also has the boy laid out on a pyre of firewood atop the makeshift altar he has built in the wilderness, all ready to burn the corpse as a sweet-smelling sacrifice to his God. And it also makes sense that the Romans were loath to do such a thing in their culture. They had not yet reached the civilizational point at which children are being born too frequently, where population becomes a burden and not a bonus. Up-and-coming societies, which are fighting all the time for survival, like the Romans, they have a need for every child. Recall how often I stated in the last couple episodes that the Romans seemed to be always at war, always fighting to survive or to conquer or both. It was probably unimaginable to Romans how someone could do such a thing, how they could sacrifice a child who would otherwise grow up and work in the fields or fight in the army. Not only did child sacrifice likely seem evil to them, it also probably seemed stupid, and perhaps it was a sign of Roman superiority, both moral and intellectual, over their enemies. To be clear, I am in the Roman camp on this one. I would not countenance this practice in my own culture, but I put up some defense for the Carthaginians for a few reasons. First, I am convinced that, in general, people seek to do the right thing. They desire to order their lives and their societies to benefit the general welfare, even if some of us hope that a little more of that welfare comes our specific individual way. But all in all, I don't think the Carthaginians woke up every day thinking about how to maximize evil and suffering in the world. Instead, I think they reacted to their circumstances with different choices than I would make. And perhaps once the tradition of child sacrifice was publicly well established, they found it hard to break the habit, felt pressured, so to speak, to keep up the ways of their fathers, which had apparently already worked quite well. Secondly, we should not rush to judge the Carthaginians when we live in a culture that deals inhumanely with other people on a regular basis and in which abortion is legal anyway. In any given year, the Carthaginians probably disposed of far fewer children per capita than we do, even if they did so in a more shocking way. Finally, I do not want us to approach the coming Punic Wars with a caricature of Carthaginian life in the back of our minds. This will not be a conflict between righteous, upright Roman defenders of order and a bunch of depraved, money-grubbing devil worshippers from Africa. The Punic Wars will be perhaps the most significant and momentous conflict between civilizations in Western history. It's hard to judge how consequential the wars in the East between the Mesopotamian powers and between Egypt were for our Western traditions. But the Punic Wars, along with the Persian War chronicled by Herodotus, will be among the most remarkable conflicts with an undeniably huge impact on the timeline of our history. And these wars should not be reduced to cartoon-like battles between virtuous Romans and shady Phoenician villains tweedling their mustaches and cackling in contemplation of their own wickedness. The Carthaginians have built a civilization. They have promoted art, financed architecture, smoothed relations between warring parties in order to further trade, and replaced military conflict with commercial competition. However complex and disturbing we may find certain facets of their culture to be, I think we must respect their contribution to the ordering of human life in the Western Mediterranean 3,000 years ago. And the Romans, though we reserve a place of honor for them in our ancestral memory, are semi-savage upstarts at this point who have no philosophy, little art, and a complete lack of regard for the finer things in life. In the coming centuries, the Romans will bewail the encroachment of barbarians on their delicate civilization. But for now, they are the barbarians. I should not overemphasize at this point the coming victory of Rome. It will take a full century for Rome to defeat Carthage completely, and the matter will hang in the balance for decades. During the Second Punic War, in fact, things will look very grim indeed for Rome long before they begin to look better. But all that is to come in future episodes. In the meantime, Carthage is still the superpower in the region, and Rome is just a rowdy upstart. But thanks to the ultimate Roman victory in this conflict, we've lost a great deal of what we might have learned about this people, who were perhaps the first to bring civilization, as we recognize it, to the Western Mediterranean. In the next episode, we will see how Rome first began to chip away at Carthaginian supremacy in a theater close to home on the island of Sicily. Until then, I thank you for listening to the Western Traditions Podcast.